to say that an important part of my job was interrupting interesting conversations that people were in the midst of having. Now that it's not my job anymore, it's just something that I'm good at. As you can see from my portrait up on the Hall of Fame or Shame, I am the former head of McLaughlin College, and I'm emceeing proceedings here today. I'm David Waitenberg. First, a procedural announcement to any students present. If you have not signed in at the register by the door, please do so. The reason is not just that we want to know who comes to these things, but McLaughlin College gives a certificate of participation to students who attend 6 or more of these lunch talks in the course of the year. And the only way we know if you have attended 6 or more is if you signed in on 6 or more occasions. So even if you don't know if you will ever come back, and we hope you will, keep your options open by making sure you've signed in today. Also, my successor, who I will be introducing shortly, has introduced a really neat thing this year. As a side benefit, not only do you get lunch at these lunch talks, and not only do you get food for thought at these lunch talks, but James Simeon is going to offer a book prize to a randomly selected name from the student sign-in list. If your name is randomly chosen, you will be contacted and asked to come to the master's office in the next few days to pick up your book. So, unless you hate books, which would be a strange thing for being a university student, make sure you have signed in. This is a really terrific panel, the first of several international days that will be recognized and celebrated here at McLaughlin College through the year. For those of you not familiar with McLaughlin College, it is the college at York University dedicated to the analysis and critical evaluation of public policy. International peace and security is a crucial public policy issue and one of the themes that will be explored throughout the year. And one of the ways, but not the only way of doing that exploring, is by recognizing several of the UN recognized international days, the first one being the International Day of Peace. Our panel to do that exploring consists of 3 people, which, yes, you should come up with. Part of that. First of them is my successor as head of McLaughlin College, Professor James Simeon, who is not only head of McLaughlin College, but a professor in the School of Public Policy and Administration here at York University. Second is Sheldon, a lifelong Quaker who is going to be exploring this year's emphasis in the International Day of Peace, namely education for peace, from a Quaker perspective. And the third is Professor Sorpong, who I welcomed back to university because he was a graduate student here years and years and years ago, back when we were both much younger. He's currently a professor of global peace and security in the Department of Politics and Public Administration at Ryerson University and is president of Science for Peace. That being said, I'll turn things over to James Simeon to introduce the International Day.
David, thank you so much for your opening remarks. And I want to also personally welcome our 2 guest speakers. I've gotten to know Sorpong over the years. We've worked together on a couple of projects, one initiated with UNHCR. And I've had the great pleasure to meet Sheldon, and we've exchanged emails over the last few weeks, maybe the last month or so. It's a pleasure to meet you in person as well, Sheldon. So welcome to both of you. As you know, today we're celebrating International Day of Peace, which is observed every year on the 21st of September, which is actually tomorrow. So tomorrow is the official World Day of Peace, or the UN International Day of Peace. And the United Nations General Assembly has declared this day to be devoted, or tomorrow, but we're celebrating it today, devoted to strengthening the ideals of peace within nations, but also across nations. And I thought it would be appropriate if we actually heard from the Secretary General for the United Nations in terms of the reading or message that he has. So I'm going to try to do this. Hopefully it'll work. The right key?
No, press the play button. If you move the cursor down.
Oh, sorry.
There you go.
I got it.
This year we mark International Day of Peace as we prepare to celebrate the 70th anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And this foundational document is a reminder that peace takes root when people are free from hunger, poverty and oppression and can thrive and prosper. With the Universal Declaration of Human Rights as our guide, we must ensure the achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals. I encourage you to speak up for gender equality, for inclusive societies, for climate action. Do your part at school, at work, at home. Every step counts. Let us work together to promote and defend human rights for all in the name of lasting peace for all.
So that was the official greeting from the United Nations Secretary General, Antonio Guterres. And as some of you might know, Antonio Guterres used to be the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees. And he did an outstanding job as the High Commissioner for Refugees for about a decade. So, and I think that really prepared him very well for the current position he occupies. Let me just also add a couple of brief notes with respect to why we're celebrating this particular day. And I'm going to make reference to the General Assembly Resolution 3667 of the 30th of November 1981, which actually established the International Day of Peace. And that particular resolution states in part, and I'm going to read this because I think it underscores an important aspect in terms of what this day is really all about. It notes the following: since wars begin in the minds of men, it is in the minds of men that the defense of peace must be constructed. That a peace based exclusively on the political, economic arrangements of governments would not be a peace which could secure the unanimous and lasting sincere support of the peoples of the world. And that peace must therefore be founded, if it is not to fail, upon the intellectual and moral solidarity of mankind. It also goes out to point out that, in fact, the United Nations has established two universities. One is the United Nations University for Peace, which was established in 1972 and is located in Tokyo, Japan. And the other is the University of Peace, which was established in 1980 on the outskirts of San Jose, Costa Rica. And I've actually had the privilege of visiting that particular university, which is on top of one of the mountains surrounding San Jose, Costa Rica. Beautiful location. It also calls on all of the member states, organs, and organizations of the United Nations systems, regional organizations, non-governmental organizations, and very importantly, peoples and individuals to commemorate in the appropriate manner the International Day of Peace, especially through all means of education, and to cooperate with the United Nations in the observance of that day. It was actually on the 28th of September 2001 that September 21st was established as the day for international peace. And it also underscored in that particular resolution, 55-282, that the International Day of Peace, including through education and public awareness, and to cooperate with the United Nations in the establishment of a global ceasefire. So on the 21st of September, what is supposed to happen around the world is that there's supposed to be a cessation of hostilities. All of the armed conflicts are supposed to cease. And nonviolence is supposed to actually prevail for the whole course of the day. Depending on how you actually define armed conflict or wars, and as I indicated last Tuesday, if any of you were here at that point in time, there are something in the order of about 67 armed conflicts of various types that are taking place around the world. And this involves something in the order of about 780 militias, guerrillas, terrorist separatists, anarchic groups, and drug cartels that are engaged in armed conflict. And the latest UNHCR Global Trends on Forced Displacement report for 2017, you may be surprised to hear this, 5 countries account for 2/3, more than 2/3 of the world's forcibly displaced persons. And that includes the following countries: the Syrian Arab Republic, Afghanistan, South Sudan, Myanmar, and Somalia. So if we were able to resolve the conflicts in these 5 countries, that would resolve more than 2/3 of the refugee problem or the forcibly displaced problem that we currently are experiencing in the world. And on that note, I'd like to turn things over to Sheldon Clark.
Thank you very much. I prefer to stand. I hope that's all right with everyone. To begin, would everyone be comfortable simply standing up for a minute? And sort of shake your hands out a little bit. You know, it's called relaxation. But pretend, since we've all been eating, that we're washing our hands. So just wash your hands. Boy, this is a good group. They know how to do it. And we're going to dry them in the sun. And they're all dry, and please be seated. I had a vision around 1965 of world peace. And the vision was this: if everyone in the world, regardless of time zone, at a chosen moment, were to drop whatever it is they're doing and simply reach into the sea or a river or the nearest body of water and wash their hands and dry them in the sun, there would be at least one moment, if not 2 or 3, of total peace. So you all today have participated in that vision. You've brought a sense of peace right here. And isn't that wonderful? It's great. Visions have ways of leading all of us into a new state of being. And that's part of the message of world peace, is to discover pathways that lead us into peace. Now, I should begin a little more formally by saying greetings, friends, and thank you, Dr. Simeon, for inviting me and including me today. A reference was made to the UN, and of course it's UN Day celebration. Trygve Lie, the first Secretary General of the United Nations, in welcoming Dag Hammarskjöld II, said to him, "Welcome to the world's most impossible job." And since the close of World War II to the present time, as we all know from historical record, world peace has not exactly broken out yet. It's coming, but not quite yet. it requires everybody to have a glass of water, wash their hands, dry in the sun, discover common humanity. Now, I should tell you that, number one, Quakers do not have a corner on the market of truth. Quakers are a small sect in the world's history of religions. There are about 2,000 Quakers in all of Canada, 100 and some thousand, maybe a little more, worldwide. It started in England as Reformation religion. It was a sect. It then became a little more organized and eventually grew to a fair population in the 18th century, and by the 19th century was set apart a little bit as a peculiar people. And then in the 20th century, really World War I catapulted Quakers out of a comfort zone into world affairs. And one of the items that occurred in that period was the founding of the Ramallah Friends School in Palestine. So for over 100 years, the Ramallah Friends School has been educating young Palestinians, of all people, to have a different perspective on the plight that their country enjoys, or does not enjoy, as the case might be. So, no corner on the market of truth. Quakers believe in the doctrine of continuing revelation. So, you might understand that is that the Bible and sacred literature in general are not closed. The Bible is not a closed canon, but rather God can speak directly to that of God in you and everyone else today. No problem. All you have to do is be able to reflect, listen, and then be led by the inner light, which is a Quaker term. And then I have to read this because it's highly important. Anyone, such as myself, who speaks for Quakers today is terribly aware of the diversity among friends in faith and practice. So you will find Quietist friends, which look like their counterparts from the 17th century, to evangelical friends, to Christocentric friends, to agnostic humanists, and variations on all that in between. Quakers today reflect the world in which we all live. You might note that the Quaker United Nations office, under the leadership in June 2013 of Andrew Tomlinson and Jonathan Woolley, who were directors of the New York and Geneva UN offices, Quaker UN offices, were jointly listed by Action on Armed Violence as one of the 100 most influential global actors in armed violence reduction. So, a very small group of people with a very large footprint in the pursuit of peace. I have to say that when I was writing my doctorate thesis, which was entitled Approach, Commitment, and Ever Afterwards, I was thinking of horseback riding. Because if you've ever ridden a horse, you start at point A and eventually wind up, we'll say, at point C. B might be a jump. So approach, over the fence, and then whatever happens afterward. Hopefully you land still in the saddle without breaking your neck. But I since have another little point of view on approach, commitment, and afterwards. It's a religious one. That all of us are new. We're all learners. Every time you say a prayer for yourself or for somebody else or a friend, it's as though for the very first time. But you approach your concept of the deity in such a manner as to be humble, making a request perhaps, or offering a little bit of praise, whatever it is you do, but then you're committed to a dialogue. And then you live ever afterward, trying to move beyond whatever the crisis moment was to new openings. And how important that is. Approach, commitment, and then ever afterwards. Peace is a little like that. Historically, in 1661, I think it was, George Fox, the nominal founder of Quakerism, wrote a declaration to the restored King Charles II, and it reads, "We utterly deny all outward wars and strife and fightings with outward weapons for any end, or under any pretense whatsoever, and this is our testimony to the whole world. The Spirit of Christ by which we are guided is not changeable, so as once to command us from a thing as evil, and again to move unto it, and do certainly know and so testify to the world that the Spirit of Christ, which leads us into all truth, will never move us to fight and war against any man with outward weapons, neither for the kingdom of Christ, nor for the kingdoms of this world." It's a statement about determining one's will, and it's collective as well as individual, that we as persons have to be the change we would like to see in the world. Who said that? Gandhi. Then we have to say, okay, if I as an individual am also a member of a group, the human family, then in order to change the human family, I'm changing, and I want to change my highly respected neighbor, and so on, multiply it out. I've seen that happen. A 19th century Quaker named John Greenleaf Whittier, a poet, worth reading, worth finding out, in a poem called The Meeting, wrote this, lines 215 to 222. "So to the calmly gathered thought, the innermost of truth is taught. The mystery dimly understood that love of God is love of good, and chiefly its divinest trace in him of Nazareth's holy face. That to be saved is only this, salvation from our selfishness." Wow, we got to confront ourselves. It's not gimme, 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 or me. It's something else. We have to be saved from our selfishness. Remember what St. Francis of Assisi said, "Lord, make me an instrument of your peace." And 500 BC, Socrates, "The unexamined life is not worth living." A contemporary friend, so I moved from 17th century, 19th century, now into the 20th century, wrote, or 21st century actually, "This is our peace testimony. It is a variety of animals, all smushed together so that we think of it as a single thing. Like King Pellinore from the Legends of King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table, we prize our relationship with it. It is ours to follow, even if we are not always sure how to follow it, or whether we might not prefer to do something easier and more pleasant instead. It is a thing to be sought, but never captured. It wastes away without that pursuit, and only rarely, in very blessed moments, does it come to find us." Wow. Peace is fleeting. Now, Fox was a biblical scholar, and William Penn, founder of Pennsylvania, said one time that if the entire English Bible of 1611, the King James Bible, was lost, it could be rewritten because Fox knew it so well. And there are many quotations. I mean, the fact that he knew it so well meant that he was inspired by many of the writings. And I have a list of quotations. The most important might be the Golden Rule. Do unto others, you would have others do unto you, which you basically know. Now, when I was young, the Vietnam War was on. I was of draft age, and I went to the draft board in Cleveland, Ohio, where I had grown up, and registered as a religious conscientious objector to war. And you might know that the Quakers, the Amish, and Mennonites were members of the traditional peace churches and all did the same thing. So instead of becoming a soldier, I was allowed to do alternative service and was assigned to the American Friends Service Committee to work in India for 2 years. So my assignment was in a very small village of about 600 people in South India. We had, I used to walk from the dwelling where I lived with my Indian family to the little school, which was the very first high school ever constructed in that part of the world. Amazing. And it's hot, it's humid, it's South India after all. And I would think B-52s are flying overhead, dropping bombs on villages like this in Vietnam. Terrible. And there's got to be some other way. I couldn't save the family dog from being poisoned, so that was an eye-opener. Being a Western European, I'm supposed to have magical powers. Didn't work. Then I was swimming in an open pit well one fine day. It was an irrigation well. No one else ever went there. I figured, gee, I had a private swimming pool. These are huge, big as this room. And I got really sick. And contrary to what you might experience today, I lost my voice. I couldn't speak. And I managed to get out of the well, go to my employer, and say, I'm very sick. And he said, right. So he took me the 10-mile slow-mo bus ride from the village to Coimbatore, a railhead center, to a doctor's compound, friends of his, and they admitted me and put me immediately to bed. I was out of it for 3 days. At the end of 3 days, I woke up, and I looked up, and there was this smiling face of the nurse who was from Kerala, southwest India, looking at me. So I said to her, Tani, Tani, that's Tamil for water. And she lifted a glass of water with a little straw in it. Powerful moment. That's all I could take was a sip. But then that sip led to new life. And over the next week, I was able to have soup, very thin, some tire, which are curds, and plain rice. And then at the end of the time, when they felt I could handle a meal, I had a very good vegetarian meal. All this because a husband and wife team of Indian doctors who had studied in the United States went back to India to provide medical help to their people in Coimbatore. Wow. You all may have heard the song, Let There Be Peace on Earth, and Let It Begin With Me, etc. That was written by Jill Jackson, a woman who attempted suicide and then decided, wait a minute, and God hasn't finished with you yet. She felt this overwhelming feeling of support and unconditional love. So if you're a parent or have become a parent, at some point in your life you'll know what unconditional love is all about. And maybe if you're a child and you look at your parents and you say, oh my God, in spite of everything I've done, they've cared for me. I became eventually headmaster of Pickering College and had some wonderful examples, but simple ones are important. It's the devil's in the details, but so is peace. Our bookstore administrator said, made it her mission to teach our students to say please and thank you. Our head of housekeeping would help the boys with their washing and mending clothes, but also listen to them. And in the course of her rounds would hear all kinds of vulgar, naughty language. She helped the entire community stop swearing and using vulgarities. It was amazing. So imagine a high school of day and boarding students who don't swear. I don't know. The other day I was in a gas station and a man pulled up to get gas. He was swearing from the get-go. When I became a pastor in Newcastle, Indiana, I used to, among other things, visit the local jail, the lockup, and a prison that was what is a medium security prison. In the lockup, I would take members of my congregation with me from time to time. One of the men, Mike Fleming, was the head of Children's Services. He's the person who literally went into a home and said, your children must come with me now because you're unfit, you're drunk, you're on drugs, you're engaged in prostitution. They didn't like him very much. He happened to be a beautiful guitar player and rock and roll singer. So when he came into the prison with me with his guitar and started to sing, you can imagine the prisoners were like, wow, where did this guy come from? And they recognized him. In the women's section, Linda Shore had been the music teacher in town. She was the music teacher in town. She walked in, we're in the room with women prisoners, and they all know her because they were her students. And she looks around and she knew every single one of them. And they're all embarrassed. How does a nice little kid who was in a music class in elementary school wind up in jail? Answer that time is up and I'm about to conclude. But they prayed for each other round the circle. No embarrassment, no problem. In conclusion, I would like to say, Educating for Peace Quaker Style is a commitment to a nonviolent way of life that lifts up the spirit of goodness, mercy, and forgiveness for the benefit of each and every one. Educating for Peace requires hard choices, self-examination. The quest for nonviolence and peace is a constantly evolving universal hope. It requires surrender of self. It requires attention to the details of husbandry, cultivation, care, and love for the world. The Quaker view of peace is not some vague, otherworldly ideal. Rather, it is the practical implementation of the vision that the positive choices people make in the here and now to serve, to love, and to be kind to one another will ultimately lead to peaceful living for all. Thank you for your kind attention. You're very rapt, very good for a minute or two over time. I appreciate that. And most especially for a glass of water.
Very much, Sheldon. Thank you.
Sorpong.
Okay. Well, I'd like to thank you for including me on this panel, and also thank Professor Leighton Brown for introducing me. I'm very happy in the sense that two of my beloved professors are here. When I was doing my PhD, they taught me, Professor David and Leighton Brown. And this is, I was away from Canada for 16 years, and I came back 5 to 6 years ago. The question that I posed today is quite challenging. I like to ask questions like that because of my background. You may not know that I, grew up in a bloody civil war. Cambodia, survived the Khmer killing fields, left, running away for life as a refugees, and finally was adopted by Canada. So it's a long journey. So I'd like to ask questions like that, although I may not have a good answer to it, but let me try. Is world peace possible? I think it's possible, but very unlikely in the foreseeable future. I don't think the world has become more peaceful and more secure. In fact, there are growing challenges, global challenges that confront us. So my argument is that world peace is possible, but unlikely to happen until democracy, human rights prevail. That's my argument. And so I want to make 3 points. That world peace, the way political realists see it, is not sustainable, it's not possible. And also I want to make the second point, and that is world peace cannot be attained by radical violent revolution. I have experienced myself and studied quite a bit, all the way through world federalism. I think that there's an idea to promote world federalism at this point. I don't think it's going to be successful. But what I can say is that there is a positive relationship between peace, democracy, human rights. And I will give a few examples real quick, no time to elaborate on it, comparing Canada, North America, the EU and ASEAN, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, and say why peace is possible at the regional level, potentially at the global level, but it's a long, long journey. Political realists, as you may know, think that peace is possible, but define peace as stable, the absence of hot war, or some realists think that the Cold War was the long peace. Yes, the long peace probably for the West, but not long peace for a lot of people around the world, including where I came from. There's so many proxy wars in many parts of the world, so I do not think that that kind of peace is something that people like me would like to see happen at the expense of so many lives. Of course, the political realists continue to make the case that even after the end of the Cold War, and that is peace. Peace, some would say a unipolar moment. In other words, when you have one dominant power, you have peace. But the trouble with this thinking is that, as I said, the traditional form of balance of power, well, basically realists say two things. Balance of power, balance of terror, and bipolarity or multipolarity or unipolarity. So I don't think that these will lead to world peace, and they tend to break down. And as I said, the balance of power, but the balance of terror resulted in so many proxy wars. So the realist peace, the realist notions of peace is possible, but not sustainable, and quite destructive to smaller powers and smaller countries. Can world peace be achieved through violent revolution, or even through world federalism? Now, I studied Mao Zedong, and the one key concept that caught my eye at the time when I was reading his work was the idea of permanent peace, as opposed to Immanuel Kant's perpetual peace. And I reflected on this a lot because of my background. Is permanent peace possible? It's desirable normatively, but I don't see how it can happen. The trouble with what I call the socialist peace is that there was no peace really. There were socialist wars between the Soviet Union and China in 1969, between Cambodia and Vietnam, brother Vietnam. They fought against imperialism together, but they ended up going to war against each other. And then between China and Vietnam, 1979. So, I reflect on this a lot. They were all socialist states, but they ended up going to war against each other. So, I don't know if the socialist approach or path to peace is possible. I have a lot of difficulty with that. The defense would be that those countries were not socialist. Well, if those countries were not socialist, when we will see one? And I haven't seen it yet. If those were not one, then I don't see how you can say, you can make a normative argument, but you cannot make an argument based on empirical observation. And that's my problem, because when I left Cambodia, I was always searching, looking, but I was no longer driven by any particular ideology, because ideology in Cambodia was so destructive. So I was more interested in empirical question. So when the Vietnamese invaded Cambodia, it was also a moment of liberation. My family left Cambodia and ran to the border and managed to go into Thailand and finally came to Canada. So the question that I always pose is that the socialist path to peace, I haven't seen one, and I don't know if I can believe that it will be possible. Another reflection on this is that the socialist regimes during the Cold War had the best opportunity to create peace among themselves, especially when they share one common enemy, the West. And yet, even China turned the United States in 1972, 70. So, even socialists themselves could not trust each other. They were sworn enemies, and I couldn't understand that. So I study, Mao Zedong, the idea of permanent peace. I did not find that very convincing at all. World federalism, because of the time constraint, let me move on. Are we reaching a stage where we can call, there's a world government, world federal government? I teach a course on global governance. I can say there is no world federalist government, and global governance is what we have now. But what we have now is that we have so many global challenges, and global governance is not capable of really dealing with global challenges. The 1990s was known as the decade of international law, but as you know, now we're not talking too much about international law, and recently John Bolton launched an attack on the ICC, International Criminal Court, and said, we'll let it die. So, in other words, power is still important, still matters, in my view. And if we look around the world, the resurgence of geopolitics is almost in a lot of places. Look at the East China Sea, the South China Sea, the Arctic, the Middle East, the Russian border around that area. It's just very difficult to say that we now are at peace. Whose peace are we talking about? So let me move on quickly to why I believe that there is a positive relationship between peace, democracy, human rights. Well, the democratic peace thesis, I still like it a lot because there is no better theory that explains best what happens in this world. The Cold War was, again, it's between the West and the socialist world. And what we can learn from history and from what is happening today is that even now you see the world split into two major blocks. In the Cold War in the past, now we can say now it's a new Cold War. But in the past, we can see the split between the United States and the Soviet Union and their allies. Now you will see, for me, the split between democracy and authoritarian states. You look at Southeast Asia, East Asia, very clear. Vanilla asked me to look at the Indo-Pacific region. It's also split between democratic state and the rest. India, United States versus China and all that, the rise of China as an illiberal authoritarian state. So the world is in a Cold War, but a different type, not socialism versus capitalism, but democracy versus authoritarianism. China, you can say that China is not a real socialist state, but definitely an authoritarian state. Russia, the same. But we look at, if I were to rank which region is most peaceful, I would say North America, Canada, and then next, Southeast Asia. But we can talk more about it, but even Global Peace Index rank Southeast Asia quite high in terms of peace and stability. But why did I say that Southeast Asia does not rank first? Because, as we look around, the refugee humanitarian crisis in Myanmar, almost all of the regimes in Southeast Asia now are very authoritarian. The Philippines, even the Philippines is friendlier to China. Cambodia is the best ally in Southeast Asia, China's ally. So what we've seen here is that people look at it. In Cambodia, for instance, recently, one party took all the votes. Thailand returned to military rule. So what you've seen is not just Southeast Asia, it's worldwide. I have an interest in reading a book, but I haven't had a chance yet, but the end times of human rights. So you see it like this. Democracy and human rights are making history globally, not just in a particular region, but North America, we have our own challenges as well. So what I'm trying to say here is that we're not there yet because the democracy and human rights are being pushed back. And my hope is that democracy and human rights will experience the fourth wave in the future, because we have waves, first, second, third wave. But hopefully it will come back at some point. I always say that there is always a temptation to look for something that we don't have, and when we have it, we get tired of it. A lot of people now in Southeast Asia and Asia, got tired of democracy and how everyone, China kind of rule, but when they get into trouble, they see the problems, and then they will remember the need to come back to democracy and human rights. So in Southeast Asia, you kind of talk about democracy as human rights in some places. It's a taboo nowadays. So to conclude, am I on time? I think there is a reason for hope that world peace is possible, but experience tell me that probably the regional approach is more realistic, and still democracy and human rights are central to this, not development. I always say that commercial pacifism is a wonderful theory, peace through prosperity, but East Asia show it. The more prosperous you become, the more willing you spend money on defense, and that is the problem with commercial pacifism. So democracy, there is a lot of empirical evidence to say that democratic states tend to fight less inclined to fight each other, but they're more willing to fight other autocratic authoritarian state. So what we see here is quite worrisome to me. Having said that, I think that we need to do what we can, and I'm always interested in the question of democracy, human rights, global governance, things like that. Civil society still play an important role at Sign for Peace. We do our part to promote non-violence. We are pro-UN, but very critical of NATO, and our groups on non-violence, and also we are staging a campaign to get Canada to sign on to the treaty to ban nuclear weapons, things like that. So we do what we can when the world still looks quite grim. Again, I'm pro-UN, Sign for Peace is pro-UN. Part of it, a large part of it has a lot to do with the fact that the UN did a decent job in Cambodia turning the battlefield into a ballot box. Cambodia is no longer a democracy, but it's a normal developing country, peaceful and stable, but still a long way to go before I can say that peace is in sight. Thank you.
Let me just moderate questions and comments. The floor is now yours. Well,
There are a lot of wars that if you look back in history, you think, what was the point? Vietnam comes to mind, maybe even the most recent Gulf War. But then there seems to be also a class of wars where you have a guy like Hitler. I think we tend to regard this as a real madman. Are all of you kind of blanket pacifists, or do you have an exception for the sort of madman type?
You're asking me.
Sure.
The example of Hitler is always number one brought up. And I think committed pacifists would prefer to find the alternative solution to a Hitler. And, but we can't go back to that period in history and re-examine and relive and look for the alternative. It's in the future that the alternative has to be found. And so by examining the history of the build-up for power of Hitler, and then the consequences, not only the war itself, but the Nuremberg trials, you suddenly get into a teaching moment, an educable moment, where people are saying, well, wait a minute, there were a series of small steps prior to the rise of National Socialism. If we had been vigilant at that time, Hitler would never have come to be. So in the future, and we have a prime example in the world today, very close to the Canadian border, of the consolidation of power increasingly in the hands of the few and focused in the public office of the President of the United States. And so there's a lot of people who are saying, wait a minute, we got to kind of put the brakes on, we have to get the checks and balances working, etc. And the similar voices are saying, well, the checks and balances have failed the test. I hope we live through the next 2 years somehow. And so the Quaker voice, the pacifist voice, is on the side of, wait a minute, let's observe the rules of law. Let's observe due process. Let's not continue the economic concentration of wealth in the hands of a few. And by so doing, enable the checks and balances to readjust in order to handle the evolving situation that seems to be coming. And I can only agree with my colleague to the left that there are dangers. And eternal vigilance, as Jefferson said, is the price of liberty. So a pacifist cannot be non-active, but has to be a voice. And that's very difficult for people to do, to speak up and speak out and not be part of the crowd. As you have, as I have, and I think others here have traveled around the world, it's very difficult to disengage. I remember I was under martial law in South India during the language riots of '65. I came to a level crossing. Military guards with machine guns at ready were sort of not, yes, maybe, allowing people to cross the railroad tracks. And I happened to be an individual, and I was a little different than all the other people around. I went around the barrier, I walked across the tracks, I went around the other barrier, and then I went into an area of Coimbatore that had been desecrated by violence. It was like a ghost town. It was amazing. All because of these language riots that were going on. You don't know. So I think we have faith that it is possible to have a voice and that one does need to speak up. Sorry, I went on.
Sorpong, James, do either of you want to comment on this point?
Very quickly. You know, I tend to put less emphasis on individual leaders like Hitler, as much as important as they are. And the lesson that I've learned from reading the rise of Hitler, not only that Hitler became a madman, but also there was also the international environment as well. The punitive measure to punish Germany, for instance, gave rise to, you know, allow Hitler to come to power because there is a lot of resentment among the German population with regard to war reparations. So I'm not someone who always, you know, in favor of any punitive measure, and I you know, in spite of the fact what Trump has done about stupid things. I like it when he negotiated with Kim Jong-un. I like it when he talked to Putin. You know, I'm not in favor of going out and punish because it has been a lot of backlash against the tribunals, the International Criminal Court, simply because, you know, a lot of countries, because, you know, you cannot just say, you know, if I punish the bad guy, then peace will be at hand. The problem with punishing the bad guy is that the bad guy fight back and then war. The problem is that punishing the bad guy who are heavily armed is not going to be working. Diplomacy is the way out. For me, so there is a need to think about in structural term, in strategic term, in institutional terms. So I like it as much as I hate dictators. I like it when we have an opportunity to have dialogue and talk to each other, engage, because there is no better way at the moment.
David, I have a couple of thoughts that come to mind. You're raising the point about the just war thesis, I think, part in terms of your question. And clearly there is a right to self-defense. So when you do have these kinds of situations where someone comes to power and uses force, presumably in an illegal manner, the United Nations is supposed to step in. The Security Council is supposed to step in and stop that kind of aggression from taking place. It's been criminalized, so it's part of the International Criminal Court. It's one of the serious international crimes. Now, there wasn't an ICC. There was no United Nations back in that period with Hitler. One would hope that the international community and the United Nations would stop those kinds of aggression. And there's also the concept of R2P, responsibility to protect. Now, I know it's a doctrine, and it's intended to stop atrocity crimes, such as war crimes, genocide, ethnic cleansing, and crimes against humanity. So those are the serious crimes that the international community and states have committed to preventing from happening, even when it's internal, when it's some sort of dictator that's oppressing their own people. So one would hope that we've gotten to the point where the international community can exercise international law, doctrines that are intended to prevent those kinds of atrocities from taking place. So those are the kinds of things that come to mind when you raise questions like that.
Yes.
So, in theme with very difficult questions, I'd like to ask a very difficult question as well. It's just an abstract one, but is permanent world peace economically sustainable in an exponentially increasing population?
My initial reaction is yes. It has to happen in order for peace to actually work. So I don't see it as necessarily being opposite in the way that you pose the question. So my reaction would be, in order to achieve that, you would have to achieve the peace. You would have to have this kind of equitable economic development and progress taking place.
Yeah.
You're not in agreement, so.
Yeah, I'm in agreement. Just that I always ask the question, how?
That's my question as well. How would it be economically sustainable if we're expected to go from 7 billion to 20 billion to 50 billion?
Yeah, well, that is a big question, right? Nobody knows the answer. But some environmentalists would say it's not a question of population growth or demographic growth. It's a question of resource management. We have so much food, we produce more food than we really need, yet, a lot of people go hungry. So in other words, we now have 7 billion, it's going to hit 10 billion soon. How are we going to, manage this? I don't know.
Flood, fire, and famine have not apparently worked as reducing world population. It's continued to grow in spite of natural causes. But the topic today was educating for peace. One of the elements of educating for peace is examining what the local population is in any particular district worldwide. And for the people, as happened in China, to put a restriction of number of children in a family. And that is very hard to implement, short of a Mao coming along and saying this is the way it'll be. An example, in India, in the period 64 to 66 when I was there, if you wanted to go to the equivalent of a drugstore that sold contraceptives and make a purchase of a rubber, for example, the cost of that particular item was more than the cost of feeding a family for a day. So how are the poor people of this world, who far outnumber the rich people of this world, going to come to terms with a culture that says, I'm a man because I can father 5 or 6 or 10 children? Or I'm a subservient woman, ignorant and kept that way, so I know nothing about what happens. And gee, another baby. Wow, a miracle. No, there's got to be shifts and changes in attitude, in cultural practices, and in developing an awareness beyond the limited horizon of the locale. Very, very difficult to do. Organizations such as Canadian University Students Overseas, CUSO, is one organization that can help. I was in a unit of 12 people who went to South India. One of those persons was already a trained nurse. She went to Kerala State, and her assignment was in an outpatient clinic in a remote area. She happened to be very gifted in picking up the local language very quickly. She was able to help the women understand birth control. Wow! It was a revolution. In downtown Cleveland, Ohio, in the black ghetto, my mother was the founder of Planned Parenthood Clinic, and it was first time many of poor black women had access to any kind of medical attention at all. Another miracle. But that's Doctors Without Borders. I mean, the United Nations itself has all kinds of programs to help with just publicize, get them known, and blitz the world with there are alternatives to having children that don't mean that you're infertile or incapable or somehow let your side down.
I just want to add one quick note. When it comes to the population growth, development is, to my understanding, the best strategy. Countries in Southeast Asia or in East Asia, China and Japan, South Korea, and Taiwan and all of that, shrinking the population. As you economically develop, the population goes down. Japan is the best example. Japan, in a few hundred years, will shrink to a few hundred Japanese left. Because people,
Sure.
they don't want to make babies when they life are comfortable.
Yes.
I want to thank you for giving me insight on Cambodia, because one of my friends in high school said she came from there and didn't understand the circumstance why, and there was a lot of trouble there. So you gave me a first-hand experience with someone who's lived there, so I now understand that kind of more. Thank you. I wanted to say something that I figured, I don't know what your name is?
Sheldon.
Huh?
Sheldon.
Sheldon. In my own personal life, I can relate to what you're saying about how you deal with not allowing a person to escalate and get to the point where it becomes so violent and so resentful and whatever. It is a lot of work. If one is to be an advocate of that and work on it, there's a lot of risk. I have a lot of things that happen to me because I'm still alive. I'm blessed. Okay, I've been saved by a lot of people. The community has helped me a lot. But this concept of how do we find good governance to regulate hormones in general anyways. It's not very easy to do, to educate people, to make sure people have better health care so we can have mounds of children, because if we used to have mounds of children, there's only a few would live, a few would get it, all that kind of stuff. And this, is there a small pocket of the world where things are kind of peaceful to really slowly that we haven't seen that? Something we haven't visioned yet, that is very, very quiet. Like, I keep what I do on a regular basis with my life, which is why I'm alive, and why my brother and sister whom I grew up with do well. Okay? And it's karma's coming back to me and leveling off, and they're backing off. And this is a very serious thing, there's a whole into detail, and understanding how I maintain peace in my own personal life. It can be filtered on. I pass this stuff on to my nephews. My sister-in-law likes it as well. It's how do you put it into the general population? Give some idea of how to make it slightly better, you know, comfortable, or keep it at bay with ever-growing violence or things that people have difficulty with emotion. And how do they express it? How are things inherited onto someone else unknowingly and it's been passed down? Or whatever is going on. I won't get into Hitler because I know somebody was treated very well by that person. Okay? So, I mean, everybody has a different side, and I don't want to fight with anybody regarding that. But that person is a very dear friend of mine, and getting a good side of that person. Everybody has a good side. Even people not treated you properly have a good side. But I try to, as I say, work inwardly and sit back and reflect. It's a very hard skill. I'm glad you explained it very clearly.
You asked a question, where in the world is there a peaceful place? Answer, York University. Resolve strikes and strife amongst the community in nonviolent ways. Congratulations.
David, I wonder if I could pose some questions to Sheldon and Sorpong, and hopefully they overlap and related. Sheldon, I was really intrigued by your comments and your life experience when you became a conscientious objector in terms of the Vietnam War. I was just wondering, could you tell us a little bit more about this? I know you were raised as a Quaker and so on, but when you made that personal choice that you were not going to go into the draft and then enter the armed forces and then serve overseas and fight in Vietnam, was there I'd just like to know if there was some sort of moral struggle. Did you? I'm sure there was probably peer pressure and other things and so on that happened to you, but obviously you had to struggle with that and make a conscientious choice in terms of that. And Sorpong, given your history and background as a refugee, someone who was in the killing fields in Cambodia, you obviously, as you said, you've reflected on this life experience and how that's sort of shaped you as well in terms of your understanding of how the world works. And I really appreciate the fact that you raised the question, is peace even possible and how could we achieve that? But given that experience, I would think it would be very difficult to come to a conclusion and say, yeah, yes, peace is possible given your personal experience. So I just want to ask you to reflect a little bit about how that might impact in terms of your own worldview as well. So those are
Sheldon and then Sorpong.
Two parts to the answer. The position of registering for the draft at that time was a legal position recognized by the United States Draft Board. So as a religious conscientious objector to war, the Draft Board had no difficulty whatsoever in recognizing my position. And the choice was to do something constructive as opposed to destructive. So the constructive part was to ask to be assigned to the American Friends Service Committee, who in turn assigned me to Volunteers International Service Association, which had small groups of people going to the United States itself, Appalachia, going to South America, going to the Middle East, and going to Africa, South Africa, and to India. And so it was a very interesting group of people, all of went different places for different reasons. But that was a movement to get to India. May I add one thing?
Just to
Yeah.
follow that up in a moment.
Yeah.
That was 1964, I think you said.
Right. I was 18 registered for the draft, finished college, so 4 years later, 22 years old, then activated my CO status.
Okay. My point about raising the date is that was in the early days of the Vietnam War. Was the receptivity of the draft system to conscientious objector status the same 5 years later with the expansion of the war and the much greater domestic disruption in the United States, to the best of your knowledge?
Well, to the best of my knowledge, there's a yes and no answer to that. Visible members, people who became conscientious objectors who were visible members of a traditional church group community, such as Quakers, Amish, Mennonite, Jehovah's Witnesses, Brethren, all could register as COs. But I have friends who were Roman Catholic, for example, not a member of a traditional peace group, who became pacifists, could not register as conscientious objectors, and among other things, went to Canada, along with many other people. It was more difficult for those who were clearly not brought up in the tradition, as it were.
Okay, I interrupted
Yeah.
you. You can carry on.
No, just a second point, which is a reflection. In my father's family, my uncle, one of my uncles, was an absolutist. He refused to register or participate in World War II for any reason whatsoever. The FBI arrested him, and he was put in a federal penitentiary in northern Kentucky, along with a friend of his from college. And the two of them were two white guys in essentially a black prison. So they were the ones who could read and write. So my uncle and friend, a man named Meredith Dallas, who I knew quite well, started a literacy program in the prison. They started where they were. They had various skills, and as the prison got used to the fact these guys weren't fermenting revolution, they were allowed to teach more and more things. That, for a period of it was over a year. The same uncle, during Vietnam, went to Quang Ngai. Are you familiar with that place? There was a Quaker hospital there with a British doctor. The Viet Cong overran the area and arrested the doctor and took her north. So my uncle left the United States. He was somewhat of a different kind of guy. He was a powerhouse in his own right. He went to Quang Ngai, found out about the missing doctor, and got in touch with the local Viet Cong, and they gave him an escort in order to go to the village where this doctor was being held captive, and literally walked her back out of to Quang Ngai to the hospital, and with the blessing. And she had provided medical assistance to North Koreans, and that particular Quaker hospital in Vietnam, South Vietnam, provided medical attention to whoever came through the door. Now that's really different. The same uncle met with Henry Kissinger and started reciting facts about the war and what was going on and the rise of U.S. airstrikes in Cambodia, and said, you know, you got to stop that. He's talking to the U.S. government. And Kissinger said, where are you getting your information from? And my uncle said, it's public knowledge. It's a matter of public record. It's available. And Kissinger was taken back by that, but he looked into it. And there was a favorable consequence to reducing some of the air raids and stuff that was going on. It's just fascinating. I had another uncle, same family, who flew troops for the occupation of Japan from California to Tokyo. And my own father was a little ambivalent during World War II, but he became a pacifist and eventually provided pro bono legal services for Americans who wanted to immigrate to Canada, and did. And then he raised money that was given to the Quaker meeting in Toronto at 60 Lowther to help with the resettlement of refugees, mainly American, some Vietnamese.
Okay. So long story, but you know, I always, based on my experience, always begin with an argument that it started me.
There you go.
I saw enough violence and people blaming each other, accusing each other of crimes they sometimes don't commit. That shaped me. Is that, you know, as a person, it starts with me. If something goes wrong, take responsibility for yourself. Don't blame others. And that's how I live my life. I struggled a lot when I came to Canada. I don't blame anybody else except working, doing my best to succeed at school. And, you know, so I fail, it's my responsibility, but I move on. Always keep moving, even if I stumble and fall. I keep moving. So the one thing I've learned from my experience is that maybe it's time to look at yourself and examine yourself and don't blame others for everything that goes wrong in this world. Because, you know, even at the global level, state leaders, blame each other nonstop. And that's how it's just so difficult to solve any problems. I am appalled, to be honest with you, by the ideological extremism on both sides, the left and the right. The Democratic Party, the Republican Party, you know, I just can't stand it, the way they trust each other. So for me, it's important to examine yourself, live a life of responsibility, and committed to nonviolence. For me, after I left, I want to chop the Khmer Rouge leader to pieces, but I learned to love and forgive. And that's, for me, is so central to my life, you know, for me, love and forgiveness deal with the moral question. Like, should we talk to Kim Jong-un? Should we talk to Putin? You know, if you take a legalistic approach, a political approach, you're not going to talk to Putin. You're not going to talk to Kim Jong-un, this ruthless dictator. But for forgiveness, give me a way out of this moral dilemma. Is that, yes, you did terrible things, but I'm willing to forgive you if there is a change to make a better world. I forgave the Khmer Rouge, and I still think that I'm right. You know, when I wrote my dissertation, Professor DeWitt was my supervisor. I always said the punitive approach, the war against the Khmer Rouge will not bring Cambodia any peace. And I got attacked, you know. And later on, I wrote another piece proving my point. The Khmer Rouge fall apart after we got amnesty. So you want to wage war and you want to go and punish them and all of that. I don't believe in it. And based on my experience, that's why I feel that my life is about loving others, forgiving others. If there is no way out, let's find something to talk to each other rather than perpetuating this dilemma, this problem. So for me, as you know, as a Christian as well, so central to me is love and forgiveness. There is no other way for me from a personal experience, personal point of view.
Thank you, Sorpong. David, you've been given a segue here.
Well, I'm not quite sure where to begin because I think I'm going to bring in cynicism and skepticism about everything I've heard. And what I've heard is very nice in terms of interpersonal relations. And those interpersonal relations can extend beyond identity groups. It can cross boundaries. I appreciate that. I also know that there's a lot of evidence, a lot of hard research that suggests if you want to really address conflict, the best thing in the world you can do is ensure that young girls are educated. There's nothing probably that leverages more into trying to create an environment where violence is reduced. And I can understand where each individual has their own individual projects, because those projects help make who you are, and they give you satisfaction, and they give you a community in which to work. But like Sorpong, I simply don't believe in any short or longer term that we're looking anywhere close to global peace, however you want to define it. I think we do a lot better job in global management. So arms control is a long-standing and not perfect way to manage a particular kind of instrument. In international law, if it's an uphill struggle, as we now see, whether it's on trade, the WTO, or it's on the International Criminal Court, it's always being challenged because those who are powerful don't want to give up their capacity to act in their interests. You know, centuries ago, millennia ago, Thrasymachus wrote that might is right. I'm not suggesting might is right, but might is very real, and it makes a difference. So it seems to me if you really want to disentangle, personal stories, which sound nice. I mean, I can tell you stories being a child of the Holocaust, but okay. But I would take Sorpong on in terms of the critical role, not always, but many times that leaders can make. Yes, they work in a context, but if they're the right or the wrong, they build their context. And the lady here who referred to Hitler, I think I could spend a day destroying anything that I just heard. And I think there's lots of evidence to suggest. And it's not just Hitler, but it's connected to the context. So I think leaders do make a difference. We see it now. So that if you are interested in peace, you have to mobilize in such a way that you bring the right individuals forward to lead. And that happens within your own constituencies. It's not going to happen globally. You might incrementally have an additive process. And so the regional construction, what our former colleague Amitav Acharya has recently written about the regionalization of multilateral processes, the management of contested interests at the regional level. That's at least manageable for all kinds of reasons. So I'll stop there other than to say that this whole project, years ago I was approached by the World Federalists and the UN, all this kind of, and I just find it, it's a lovely thing to escape to, but it's not where you're going to make a difference.
You just said something really important as you started, which was the education of women is essential. And I just would underscore that, and it reflected, I think, one of the points I made. But absolutely, because it's women who will control what goes on. And we can find an example in ancient Greece to support that. But it's, you may not know, I'll just say, all the women of the world of ancient Greece decided the stupid wars were too much. So they shut down the bedroom. Guess how fast peace broke out?
Yes, so
I don't think I disagree with you at all, except that I didn't have time to include everything.
Sure.
I'm not saying that peace will break out anytime soon. I think my overall argument is about possible, but when and how, and that is my take on this. In the foreseeable future, there will be no peace, and there is a lot of potential for conflict and war for the reason that I have described. So I just want to sound a bit more optimistic. That's all. But but the regional approach, yes, that's what I say. We can learn from ASEAN, we can learn from the EU, we can learn from North America. But even that is not easy to learn because each region has its own unique history and all of that. So very difficult for Africa, even Northeast Asia to learn from the EU and North America. But it's possible. I'm not saying that it's going to happen anytime soon, but it's possible. So I'm still, when you ask me to reflect on my personal life, the response was that this is how I live my life. Not to change the world, but at least start with me. That's all I want to say.
I have just one question and a comment. I'll begin with a comment. I find it very difficult to relate when peace is discussed in an abstract form. I mean, peace is an ideal, but everyone, every community, and every state has different versions of what peace should be and how peace can be a process to be achieved in form of good governance. And so the assumptions that underlie in a federalist approach or in a global governance approach would, in many ways, do not take regional or communal views of the peace processes. I'm just stressing that the processes, peace processes, are as much important, if not more important, than the end goal and the destination. If there's enough time taken for the peace processes, then probably instead of one big, whole, idealistic notion of peace, there would be much more of manageable stability within each communities and within each states. So with that kind of comment and related to this context about processes and communities and so on, my question is, I think Sorpong already mentioned that, but should we not talk about peace in the context of development, in the context of sustainable development goals? I mean, it's also coming back to a pro-human approach. And then visualizing different scenarios of possibilities in specific contexts.
Anyone care to respond?
Go ahead.
Sustainable development to me is very important in managing global population growth and all of that. It's very important to the questions that we always have. But it depends on how you really define it. But I tend to say three things when we talk about peace. Yes, development is important, but also democracy and human rights. You can have development without democracy. East Asian experience tell me that when countries prosper, they have more money to spend on defense, and they don't get along. Not necessarily. They have a lot of tensions. China, Japan, South Korea, all those countries. So yes, it's important, but not sufficient. You need other factors as well to talk about world peace. And that's why, when we look at North America, yes, development is also important, but also democracy and human rights. The question is how you sustain democracy and human rights even in North America.
I would use the example of Gandhi. He started sustainable development with the spinning wheel, the hand-turned spinning wheel. Everybody knew, not everybody knew, but most people knew how to spin cotton into thread and weave the thread into saris and clothing and dhotis and you name it. Villages dedicated themselves to be producers of local products. Okay, the impact of khadi, which is homespun, on British industrial might was phenomenal, because no longer could the Brits take and get and then return at a higher price a finished product. All of a sudden they're faced with no market. Oh dear. Development began because an individual understood sustainable development begins where the people are at this present moment. The spinning wheel was the symbol of that, and it's on the Indian flag today. Interesting.
It's a really great question, and what occurred to me is that yes, peace is an ideal, but when we think about it, do we live in a non-violent world at the collective level, societal level, communal level, and international? And I think the challenge that the United Nations has posed for us for tomorrow is that we should try at the individual level, at the family level, communal level, societal level, to live a non-violent world. And it begins with the individuals. And then it builds from there. And I think when the UN calls for a cessation of hostilities in terms of the 67 or more armed conflicts that are going on in the world today, and most of them being non-international armed conflicts, so they're interstate conflicts, and that there's a ceasefire that takes place, that all of us are personally challenged to live that ideal. And if we can do it for a day, perhaps I'm an idealist, David, but I think if we can do it for a day, and we can aspire to this non-violent existence, then maybe peace is really possible.
So James,
Yes, you are an idealist.
in the early 1990s, there emerged a literature that had a lot of impact in terms of the debate that took place. The Coming Anarchy, right, was one of them, and The End of History was the other. And then came The Clash of Civilizations. Those, at that time, were all attacked for different reasons, but they were all attacked. If you look at evidence now, you might well want to argue that all three authors were prescient in terms of the arguments and the implications. And I'm sorry I missed your opening remarks, so I'm going to throw it back directly to you. If you look at the 65 million who are refugees or forcibly migrating or displaced IDPs in the world, where is the resolution without some form of conflict? There may be structural violence rather than war, but this is not an issue that the international community, since the UNHCR was founded, and passports came along a little bit earlier, has been able to manage. And it's not even just resolved, they can't even manage it. And you can't manage it because states have intrinsic interests in either preventing or forcefully removing, and to where? Other parts of the globe who don't want to receive. So that, for me, is an example of where if you really want to take the intellectual discussion and translate it into trying to act, you start breaking it up into pieces and saying, where are the weak links? Where maybe we could deal with 750,000 Rohingya? Can we do that better? But you still have 65 million and growing. And that's your area of expertise, James. So that to me is one of the most profound challenges to any idea of world peace, world federalism, because the intense interests are too great.
It's actually 68.5 million, it's probably 69 million.
Okay, it changed from when I left my office to when I walked over here.
But one of the things that the Global Trends Forcible Displacement Report for 2017, which is for statistics for 2016, more than 2/3 of the world's refugees are produced by 5 countries.
Sure.
And I referred to these countries before. Syria, the deadliest armed conflict in the world today. 6.3 million people forcibly displaced. 3 times more than the others. Afghanistan, South Sudan, Myanmar, and Somalia. If we could stop the wars in those 5 states, we solve 2/3 of the world's refugee problem. That's, maybe I'm overly simplistic in terms of my understanding of the world, but I think the root cause of forcible displacement in the world predominantly has to be non-international, protracted armed conflict.
That gets back to Sorpong's issue of local politics.
Yes.
And is the end of ideology, at the end of history, was it correct? Because we don't see.
I don't see it.
We don't see it happening.
Yeah, that's my concern. In fact, it's getting worse. Except that I would say, when we talk about the kind of split at the global level, it's not that fierce, as ideological as it used to be, but more in terms of autocratic state versus democratic states. It doesn't mean that there's no ideology involved. It's just that that's the bigger picture for me.
Yeah, we have time probably for one more question. Go ahead.
I think more of a comment than a question at this point, but I've heard so many wonderful different approaches, all of which resonate with me personally. I think the one thing that I personally believe is that education, and not just for young girls, but education in general, is the key to resolving peace, because I think conflict stems from that general lack of understanding and humanistic empathy. And what I mean is, it's not just the understanding of the world around you. Because knowledge, the more knowledge you gain, the more wisdom you gain, the less sure you are of your decisions, so to speak. It takes more time to consider all possible outcomes, not just the easy way. Conflict often is the easy way, right? And one thing is like breaking down the boundaries. Not only educating people to think critically, to understand the conflict from both sides, not just us versus them, because that's the true fire. From my personal experience, at least, that's the fire of conflict. I came from Israel in 2006 when the bombs were flying and falling, and I initially came with like this aggression against Palestinians, because where I grew up, I was taught that I was going to die, if I kicked something on the floor, or a terrorist was going to come and shoot up the mall, and that was the reality of everyday life. But when I came here, I met a family of Palestinians who told me the horrors that they suffered on the Gaza Strip, and that was the first time it shed the light on me, understanding that there are people on the other side of the conflict, just like me. People who suffer the same ailments, people who feel the same feelings as me, they're people. And that's what we often lack. We dehumanize the other side, and we allow our government to do this, because the population, for the most part, don't have that understanding of, these people we believe the rhetoric against, so to speak, are people. They have very little to do with the conflict. but they're the ones suffering the consequences of this conflict. And I think peace can be achieved through that education, but it's not going to be achieved anywhere in the century or the century after that. It's a very slow progression of re-education, of introducing new values to students, to young people, because that's where the change is going to be. The reason I asked the population question is because, in my understanding, peace is a very slow progression. If we want to implement change, even though peace is an ideal, there is nothing wrong with holding that ideal high and sacred, because it's something we can reach for and then eventually get there, or maybe not, but the process of getting there is more important than denying the process because it's impossible or we perceive it to be improbable. You know, same with learning. We can never know everything in the world, but we still strive to learn as much as we possibly can, right? But the question becomes, will we be able to do this in time? Are we going to be able to re-educate and learn peace before our time runs out due to overpopulation, due to climate change, and the number of other disasters that we're currently looking at?
That's a marvelous concluding comment because it speaks so centrally to the importance of education, which is the theme of today. Let me just observe something in conclusion. James began and more recently reminded us of the 5 conflicts in the world that are currently producing more than 2/3 of the displaced persons and refugees in the globe. But we heard in the course of the discussion, Sheldon was a conscientious objector during the war in Vietnam. There is no longer a war in Vietnam. Sorpong was a refugee from the war in Cambodia. There is not currently a war in Cambodia. In their time, those were the intractable, most devastating conflicts in the world, like Syria today, not like but decades ago, comparatively. Much of the discussion has been about peace as an absolute. Is total global peace possible, and if so, how? A more manageable, attainable, realistic kind of question is, can individual conflicts be resolved so as to arrive at peace? Or even more importantly, can potential intractable, devastating conflicts be ameliorated before they reach that stage? And the cumulative result of that might be something much closer to the attainment of global peace. I would like to, in closing, offer a token of appreciation to Sheldon and Sorpong. No appreciation for James, because James has already received one of these tokens of appreciation. This has become one of the most coveted items at York University. It cannot be bought. It can only be awarded in appreciation for giving a talk here at McLaughlin College.
Thank you very
So,
much.
thank you.